Oh, Ms. Weisenthal, are you ready?
Yes, I am.
Thank you. Good morning. We're now on the record. It's 9 a.m. on Thursday, July 11th, 2024. This is a public comment hearing in proceeding 24R-0192G, a rulemaking considering amendments to the Commission's gas rules to implement the provisions of Senate Bill 23-291, requiring establishment of mechanisms to align utility financial incentives with the financial interests of its customers on incurred fuel costs. I'm Eric Blank, the PUC chair and the hearing commissioner for this proceeding. This hearing is being webcast and will always be live. A court reporter is transcribing oral comments for the record in real time. The Commission opened this rulemaking in April by decision number C24-0278. Attached to that notice of proposed rulemaking, or NOPR, are proposed amendments to the existing Commission rules governing the fuel cost recovery mechanism known as the Gas Cost Adjustment Clause, or the GCA. The NOPR explains the Commission's proposal for a new symmetric sharing mechanism, the Gas Performance Incentive Mechanism, or GPIM, as contemplated in the statute. The proposed mechanism would compare benchmark gas rates for each quarter with the same quarter in the previous year. Outside of a deadband of 20 cents per decatherm to account for some of the natural fluctuations in the price of natural gas, the difference in benchmarks is then used to calculate the sharing amount every quarter. The sharing amount, as proposed, is 5% of the difference between benchmarks multiplied by the total gas quantity for the then completed calendar quarter. The proposed rules cap the sharing amount at an amount equal to 40 basis points pre-tax return on the utility's rate base and provide that the sharing amount will be recovered through each utility's GCA deferred account balance. The proposed rules also make accompanying modifications to gas purchase and deferred balance reports and prudence reviews to eliminate references to the older GPIM approach and to require reporting needed for the calculation of the new GPIM benchmarks. Today, we'll receive oral comments, including responsive comments to the pre-filed written comments already submitted. We've read the comments, and those comments do not need to be presented again orally this morning. At the same time, additional written comments are also welcome and can be submitted through our e-filing system or through our website using our online comment form, or by sending them to Dora_PUC_website at state.co.us. If using any of these methods, please specify the comments apply to proceeding number 24R-0192G. I just point out that written comments are recorded the same weight as oral ones. Before we start, are there any preliminary comments or matters from the participants? Hearing none, before turning to the utilities and UCA who filed written comments, are there others here this morning who would like to make oral comments on the proposed rule changes? Again, other than the utilities or UCA, if there's anyone who'd like to make comments, can you raise your hand now? All right. With that, I was just propose we go through the utilities in alphabetical order and go to UCA. So I just start with Atmos. Is someone from Atmos here who would like to, Mr. Stoffel?
Good morning, Chairman Blank. Nick Stoppel with Holland Hart, appearing on behalf of Atmos Energy. We also have Kenny Malter from Atmos with us this morning. He is the Director of Gas Supply and Services at Atmos Energy. So don't have anything specific to add in addition to the written comments that we provided. We did get the proposed blue lines that Piesco filed and have reviewed those. Atmos doesn't agree with everything in those proposed rules, but it certainly agrees with the direction that the Piesco proposal takes compared to what the Commission originally proposed in the NOPR. But happy to answer any questions you might have regarding the Atmos comments.
Yeah, I do have one question for you and the other utilities. just reading the statute, it asks us to establish mechanisms, and let me just read it, that align an investor-owned utility's financial incentives with the financial interests of its customers regarding incurred fuel costs. And just can you help me understand how the mechanism you're proposing would have performed first during Storm Uri in terms of aligning customer and utility incentives, and then during the natural gas run-up during the winter of 2022 and 2023? Would what you're proposing have been guaranteed to align incentives for those events and, for any similar events in the future? And you may not have like a quantitative answer now, but I guess that's, sort of the core thing we're struggling with, and just wondering if you have any comments or guidance on that.
Yeah, so let me respond as it relates to the statute, and then I hope Kenny can provide some feedback regarding how it would have performed, or at least conceptually would have performed given those pricing events. But not only, so the part you were referencing, 2A, provides that it should align the incentives. One of the issues I've had in this proceeding and interpreting the statute is the starting point that the interests or incentives are misaligned. What misalignment are we trying to address? And I raise that because we're in an environment where the gas utilities do not earn a return on gas costs. They currently receive no upside. And in fact, they pay interest on any over collection, but do not collect interest on any under collection of gas costs. So we're starting from a position where customers pay for prudently incurred gas costs, and utilities are entitled to recover their prudently incurred gas costs. And so from there, the question is what is out of alignment that we were trying to address? And so then I also look at 2B in the statute that says the mechanism must be designed to protect customers and to improve the utility's management of fuel costs. And I think that's where we really struggle with the commission's proposed mechanism, because with it being backward looking, there's really nothing a utility can do given the realities of current gas procurement that would actually help them improve their management of fuel costs. As we've articulated, it really would create an arbitrary outcome either direction, just comparing how gas prices change globally really year to year. And we've seen that, from a pandemic with a depressive impact on prices, from a war in Ukraine that increased prices quite significantly. And then also those are further exacerbated with some of the cold weather events we've experienced in the region. So I think it's really, you're having to look at 2A and 2B to figure out the right answer here. And one of the questions we have is really, what is out of alignment that we're trying to address? And based on that, we could create a mechanism potentially to provide some incentive to better manage those fuel costs, but a backward-looking one does not accomplish that goal. Now, let me see if Kenny's here to talk about how the idea of either a historic benchmark or a forward-looking benchmark would have performed during Winter Storm Uri.
Can I just sort of maybe push you a little further?
Yeah.
I mean, it seemed like the problem was customers face, depending on the utility, tens of millions or hundreds of millions of higher than expected costs, and the utilities were largely unimpacted.
Well,
I think that's the alignment of incentives the legislature may have been trying to address. So that's our struggle, where you have hundreds of millions of cost showing up in the case of Excel, obviously less for Atmos at a time period, and the utilities being completely insulated while having at least some influence over how the hedging, storage, and other aspects of gas market work. So
I think to begin with, that's not accurate to say the utilities were fully insulated. My understanding is all of the utilities actually have borne the carrying costs associated with amortizing those balances over a longer period of time. And one of the things that's been frustrating for me as a utility attorney practicing before the commission is the actual success of the regulatory process in managing that rate impact for customers in Colorado seems to be ignored. The fact that we were actually able to isolate those extraordinary costs, hold a separate prudence evaluation for them, utilize the creative use of existing regulatory assets to offset that balance, and then amortize them over a longer period of time with no carrying cost on the balance, was actually a very appropriate resolution of the issue. And I go back to, yes, those costs were extraordinary, but there was no upside in those extraordinary costs for the gas utilities, right? That they had to go out and procure gas for customers to use in very difficult market conditions. Fortunately, in Colorado, at least for Atmos, all of the suppliers performed. We weren't dealing with force majeure issues with failure to actually deliver gas for customers, but the costs were extraordinary. So, but I go back to, so I get there's a perception that the utilities had to go buy gas and gas costs were far more higher priced than expected going into those events. But does that really reflect a misalignment of incentives? Because the utility's job was to ensure that customers had the gas they needed when they turned their appliances on. And it would have been a very different story if customers were going to use gas and it was unavailable.
Would you characterize the price run-ups in 2022 and 2023 the same way?
In terms of just the market spike from the cold weather in the Northwest and how we're seeing just
no, just the well, I mean, obviously the legislature didn't agree with you because they passed legislation, it seemed like.
Well, they passed this legislation. Obviously, there's a public outcry regarding utility rates. There's no doubt about that. As you're well aware, there's more than one driver on utility rates in Colorado these days. And I think what we're seeing is kind of having to take this public outcry and political reaction to it and now filter it through the realities of how gas procurement works for utilities in Colorado. And I go back to this. So how are the incentives out of alignment? And you talked about the hedging plan. That's something the commission reviews and approves. So the utilities were performing under their commission approved hedging plans, which are not intended to provide the lowest price possible for the hedged gas, but to provide some certainty and stability in pricing. And then as we've explained, gas procurement, other than the hedge volumes, also relies on a blend of first of the month pricing and day ahead pricing to try to balance that volatility with also capturing some of the benefits of a market that can turn down, right? And so that's, I think, that's part of the challenge here is it's also not like gas is purchased for a month at a single price currently. Gas is hedged. Gas is purchased in some volumes at the beginning of the month, and then also balanced with day ahead purchases, plus utilizing storage, which primarily provides a system operational reliability benefit, but due to the nature of storage, typically brings with it some price savings or cost savings because storage is injected in the off summer or the off heating period. So yes, the legislature did come up with this legislation. It does not mandate the kind of outcome that the commission has proposed in the rules included with the NOPR here.
All right. So your comment, your answer basically is you sort of don't agree with the premise of the question that that your mechanism does not align incentives is the way at least we're thinking about, where, you know, when customers are harmed, you know, or, you know, where when customers win, the utility wins, and when customers lose, the utility has some symmetric sharing. Your proposal does not do that, but you don't agree with the premise of the question.
I don't necessarily disagree that, or I don't agree that the proposal, certainly that Piesco's put forward, and I think the current GPIM, the one it contemplates, would create that kind of symmetrical sharing and would, in theory, align those incentives. I think the challenge is, again, you're creating just an upside or a downside based on gas procurement that doesn't exist today, right? There's no incentive for utilities to drive up the cost of gas for their customers. I guess that's the challenge I'm having is in the current gas procurement situation in Colorado, utilities have no incentive to increase that cost for their customers. In fact, I think this legislation, the recent events we've talked about since 2021 show utilities have a real incentive to keep gas costs low. And they're trying to figure out how to do that in a competitive market where they are price takers and where there are some tools like hedging or first of the month pricing available to help mitigate against volatility. But you also get in a world where if you locked in a bunch of high prices and the market turned down, customers would be really upset that they were overpaying. And that's the balance we're trying to strike here, right? Is that the price can only go to zero. The price can, in theory, go up to any level depending on what's happening with the market. And so I struggle with all of this conversation with the starting point saying, well, how are our interests out of alignment? And then to try to create an incentive to bring them into alignment, you have to first identify the problem. And the problem that's been identified is gas costs were really high, but that really hasn't come with the identification of how the utilities had some financial incentive that was inconsistent with the interests of their customers.
Ms. O'Neill, do you have any comments or questions?
No, I mean, I appreciate all the comments, and I think your question sort of hit the nail on the head, Chairman, that we're just trying to struggle through an incentive that can address a number of different situations with intra-month price spike like Winter Storm Uri, a long-term run-up in gas prices like we experienced 2 winters ago, and find a way that's both fair to the utilities and incentivizes management of the gas costs while creating some sort of, for the proverbial win-win, lose-lose situation, right? And I appreciate the comments, Mr. Stoffel. You know, it is still the case that the public service proposal doesn't, like, none of them, I think, check all of the boxes, right? That proposal does not actually address the sort of winter storm or winter events from 2 years ago where the prices were high and sustained and the market prices were high and sustained. And the customers bearing all of the brunt of that, of those costs.
Well, and I think it's just important to clarify, customers are bearing all of the prudently incurred costs. So utilities do still carry the risk of imprudence. And in the Winter Storm Uri example, as I noted, those costs were separately identified and subject to a separate prudence review, but all gas costs are subject to a prudence review. And so I think that's an important thing to consider here too. I mean, in terms of aligning financial incentives, the utilities assume the risk of a prudence disallowance when they go out and buy gas for their customers. And customers have no financial risk when they use the gas. They have the risk of paying the cost for it as established by the commission.
They have no risk of prudence, but they bear all of the costs. So, I mean, the profiles are different, right? And the risks are different, but the consumers have no control over the price of that and often don't know the price of it when they're making their consumption decisions.
Right.
And
but
some of that is intentional, but just saying, like, there are just different risk profiles, and the utilities may have less control than we would all like about those prices, but consumers have zero control over the prices.
Well, and as we noted in our reply comments, the commission staff, and I think it was you, Ms. O'Neill, who gave the presentation, noted the utilities do not have control over the wholesale price of gas either. So that when the utilities go out and buy it, as I mentioned, there are some tools they can use, hedging, long-term purchases, trying to strike the right balance between monthly purchases and day-ahead purchases, but they don't really have control over the ultimate price. And so that is not a point of distinction between the utility and their customers.
Agree, completely agree with that. I think with the caveats that you provided, that I think there are a list of other tools and things that the putting together the gas purchase plans, looking at the market, understanding what customers are interruptible, what noticing you can do to provide. There are actions that help mitigate costs that the utilities do have in their control. So just saying, like, I'm not saying that you all control the commodity price of gas. also the kinds of products that are provided in the market. And you know, I think there has been some discussion about whether there's any ability for purchasers to influence those products, what is offered as a mitigation method. Recognizing that insurance costs money, and that if you buy certain products, they may come with a premium. And you know, I think gas hedging programs that exist have recognized that.
Well, and I think the important thing in what you said that the current GPIM rule captures, but this proposal doesn't, is those tools vary by utility in terms of what's available, and even within a utility vary by gas cost area. And so, for example, there are areas where no more storage is available, right? That if storage was identified as the right part of the solution here, it's unavailable to go procure more. And similarly, that just even the number of suppliers in different regions in the state varies. And so that's, it's one of the interesting things we've focused on for Atmos as we've gone through this, is from a gas supply standpoint, Atmos is really 3 different utilities in the state with 3 different gas purchase plans, gas cost adjustment rates. And so to lump them all together under a single mechanism and to not kind of drill in to say, okay, what tools are available for each GCA area, and based on that, what kind of GPIM structure makes sense, we think is something that the current rule contemplates and would allow for, while the proposed rule does not.
Anything further, Ms. O'Neill?
No, I think that's good for now.
All right. Well, appreciate the dialogue to both of you. It's really, really helpful to me, and I think the public. Anything else you want to add, Mr. Stoffel, before I jump to Black Hills?
No, I would like to give Mr. Malter a moment to comment on, you know, kind of his thoughts on how any of these mechanisms would have worked in the Winter Storm Uri, or just in a more macro run up in prices. Kenny, are you?
Yeah, also the follow-up to the, you know, Russian invasion of Ukraine and the sustained 6-month price increase, and where we actually saw you know, based on prices based on indices that were higher than the actual gas prices that were occurred. So any thoughts on that, Mr. Malter?
Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Great. Thanks for the opportunity to talk about this a little bit. And Nick did a great job of really talking about our position, and did a great job of representing gas supply as well. But when we look at it from a gas supply standpoint, we do pride ourselves on the risk mitigation tools. And Nick talked about a couple of them, whether it was our hedging program, the aggressive nature of how we, over time, added storage into our portfolio, specifically for the Colorado area, which helped us tremendously during Uri and during some of these price spike ups. But like Nick mentioned, those tools are somewhat limited. And as we look at the next tools that are available, they're very expensive. There are ways to maybe get a little bit more price stability as we look forward, but it's a very expensive cost if you're looking for specific price stability. So if we're going to continue to just look backwards and say, how are we doing compared to what we did in the past, and we have a price spike or run up, you know, we'll always be in a position where, you know, whatever mitigation tool we put in place, the GPIM, as we're looking backwards, we're always going to be in a place where, you know, the utility is going to start sharing in that differential, or that cost as well. Like Nick talked about, we have no control over the market price of the gas. We do our best with the risk mitigation plans. Regardless of the plan we put in place that looks backwards, again, something that Nick hit on very, very strongly, it doesn't talk to the nature of, are the utilities doing the right thing? Are they doing the most prudent gas procurement at the end of the day? It doesn't really impact that. You might even be more imprudent if all you're worried about is making sure that, you know, the price today isn't much worse than the price it was a year ago. So, you know, that's the challenges I would have from a gas supply perspective. Nick talked about the challenges within Colorado. A lot of our jurisdictions, we have many opportunities to move gas on different pipelines, different areas, use different storage facilities. There's redundancy of upstream assets. Colorado, it's geographically challenged, especially in our areas, so we don't have a lot of those opportunities. We've had a couple and we've seized on those, and those have been very successful in helping us reduce costs over time. But again, we don't have those opportunities for a lot of redundancy or alternate supply sources. So we're very limited in what we can do when these things happen outside of the assets that we currently have. So we're subject to the market prices. That's not an imprudent way to do our business. I think as we look at it going forward, we view this as just more of a, or at least I view this as more of a smoothing mechanism over time. And there might be a better way to do just a smoothing mechanism if that's really the goal of what we're trying to achieve here, is to try and shave off a little bit of the cost during the highest price. I think what we get into and what we've heard time and time again is we don't want to cost shift for our customers. And I think these programs, it's exactly what it does when we're not charging the customers the cost that they incurred when they use the gas. We're really potentially shifting that cost to customers that may or may not have even used the gas during that time period.
Thank you. I'll jump to, unless you guys have anything else, I'll jump to Black Hills. Mr. Koshin.
Good morning, Chairman Blank. Emmanuel Koshin, representing Black Hills. I also have with me today Ms. Jody Culp, Vice President of Gas Supply and Transport Services, Mr. Jay Bauer, Senior Manager of Gas Supply Services, and Mason Harrison, Principal Regulatory Analyst. In response to the questions posed, rather than simply saying ditto, I've got to say very well said by Atmos. I wanted to start today by saying that the company appreciated that UCA's response comments highlighted Black Hills' prior filings where it expressed reservation and concern with respect to the impacts associated with PIMS. Those concerns continue, and Mr. Stoffel laid those out very well. We are available to answer any additional questions you may have. We do agree with Mr. Stoffel that current Rule 4607, where each utility would be required to file applications to address PIMS, is probably the right approach. We also agree with both CNG and Black Hill and Atmos that for utilities with fewer than 50,000 customers, they should be exempted from the PIM requirement. Atmos just kind of walked through their scenario where they've got 3 GCA areas having, some of them might have less than 50,000 customers. Different tools are available in those areas. Again, the PIMS should be specific, and where you've got fewer than 50,000 customers in a specific area, an exemption is probably appropriate. Taking it a step further, I believe Black Hills is the only utility in Colorado with 3 separate base rate areas and several GCA areas that cross between those base rate areas. And so again, each utility is different. There should be provisions that allow for the appropriate tools to play into that utility's PIM mechanism.
Appreciate it, Mr. Koshin. Anything else from Black Hills?
Nothing further, Your Honor.
Thank you, sir. CNG, Mr. Davidson, any comments you'd like to share?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mark Davidson, law firm Fairfield and Woods, appearing on behalf of Colorado Natural Gas. I would just echo the comments that Mr. Stoffel made. I thought they were very comprehensive and thoughtful. I will say, as you know, Colorado Natural Gas is the smallest LDC in the state, and we have even fewer tools available to manage gas pricing. As Mr. Stoffel indicated, and I think Ms. O'Neill acknowledged, the LDCs are price takers, and we don't control the wholesale gas market price. And our situation is even more limited because we don't do financial hedging. Storage is extremely limited in the areas that CNG serves, and with roughly 25,000 customers, adding storage is most likely cost prohibitive. So to the extent that there are situations where we can moderate the price impacts, we do everything that we can for the reasons that were stated earlier, since there's no advantage to the company by increasing its gas prices. And I would say to a certain extent, we're in a situation where this is a solution in search of a problem for the LDCs, in that we don't control the pricing, but the legislature has directed the commission to establish these rules. And Mr. Malter, I thought, had a good suggestion about the smoothing approach that could perhaps be one mechanism to come out of this process. I don't know specifically how that might work, but it's preferable to, I'll say, a more prescriptive approach that punishes utilities for meeting customer demand in exigent circumstances, which is our obligation to serve. And so we're very cognizant of that obligation. We do everything we can to minimize pricing, but at the end of the day, it is a pass-through with no benefit to the company. And as Mr. Stoffel indicated, in some respects, the lack of recovery of carrying costs from Winter Storm Uri and things like that can negatively impact the utility. So I would just echo those comments. And to the extent you have a technical rate-based question or something like that, Mr. DiDomenico is online here on behalf of the company as well, if you have something specific. But we would just acknowledge the situation is an awkward one for the commission, a difficult set of circumstances you're dealing with. We appreciate that. And we hope that you take the comments provided in both in writing and today's oral hearing in consideration for how we try to manage our way through this. Thank you.
Appreciate it, Mr. Davidson. Public Service Company of Colorado. Mr. Berman.
Good morning, Chair Blank. Can you hear me okay?
We can.
Great. Largely would echo, first of all, introduce myself. Steve Berman, Regional Vice President of Regulatory and Pricing for Public Service. And also here today with me is Mr. Richard Derryberry, who leads our gas purchasing efforts for PSCO. And he can certainly answer any questions and provide additional context. But I would just maybe make initial comments that, we largely agree with what has already been said, even though we may have a slightly different take on things. With the blue lines we filed, recognize that we just did recently file those. So happy to talk about and take any questions there might be related to those. I think I would say generally a couple things at the top. The legislation, I think, had pretty much two parts to it. We're kind of in this incentive alignment part, but we did also have a volatility piece of this, which I think the company has addressed through the gas price risk mitigation plan that the commission approved. And I think that piece does create a mechanism that would alleviate some of the concerns from Uri and some of the high run-ups that we saw previously. So I think these things work in tandem. And I just want to point that piece out because I think it's an important piece. Historically, and many of the tools we use, like hedging, are really to try to reduce volatility for customers. And I think we've done a good job with those tools and with the additional tool that we now have in that toolbox. I would say generally that our comments have focused around adding additional risk specifically around gas and fuel prices. And what we really want to hammer home is that if we're going to be adding risk, we should have a good reason to do that. And the legislation also calls for a mechanism that would improve the utilities management of fuel costs. And I think largely what our comments have said is that we don't think a backward-looking benchmark does that. And that's why we're really pushing for something more current that can be used as we purchase in the current market. And so that's really one of the major focuses we have, and then just understanding the risk that's added, because ultimately, as risks compound, they eventually will weigh on the cost of capital for the utility. So we just want to ensure that we're structuring things in a way that it's the appropriate amount of risk and that it does actually impact the management of fuel costs. I think those were the primary highlights I wanted to point out, and we're happy to answer any questions.
You just let me try and ask you the same question that I asked Mr. Stoffel from Atmos. To the extent that, you know, there's a $500 million increase in costs with Storm Uri, or a similar, more sustained run-up that shows up on a very short notice because of the way usage patterns work, you know, in the winter of 2022. You know, one view of the legislation is that, you know, when customers are hurting, there should be at least some small cap sharing of, you know, both the benefit and the pain of that. And, you know, I guess we can argue what the legislature intended to do. But if that is a view of what the legislature wanted to do, does your mechanism accomplish that, where there's some, you know, confined cap sharing of pain when customers are, you know, hammered, and when customers benefit, some sharing of reward? Does the public service company proposal align if it's defined that way?
Yeah, I mean, I think what Ms. O'Neill was saying is accurate. It's hard to capture all of those things in one mechanism. I do think that what we've proposed certainly would cap out whatever the cap on that is, would cap out in a Uri-like situation. And again, we've put the other mechanisms in place to ensure that customers are not going to see a very volatile impact from that we have all these mechanisms now to pull those costs aside, to look at the prudency of those, to spread them over a longer period of time, to build up some funding, which we're doing right now, to help pay for some of those costs if we see them. So I think some of the other programs certainly help address that. I think in a Uri-like situation, you would see the utility hitting the max on this mechanism that we've proposed. I think it's a little more challenging in the sustained run-up if you're looking at, you know, benchmarking against a current index, because that current index will also reflect kind of those current prices. So from that perspective, you know, the backward looking certainly would cap out. But I think, as we highlighted in our comments, if we backcast the backward looking mechanism, especially given the high prices we saw and then the extremely low prices we've seen in the last year, over 5 years, we saw that, you know, essentially wipe out to zero, with puts and takes every year. And so we're adding risk and volatility to the company. And at the end of the day, at the end of 5 years, we're ending up in the same place, and we're ending up at a zero. And so that's one of our concerns, is like, we want to make sure that we're thinking about how we're adding that risk and if there's real benefit to doing that.
And just let me ask this: under the public service company proposal, is it possible that customers could be getting hammered like they did with Storm Uri, or like they did in the more extended run up in 2022, 2023, but the company could be rewarded in those circumstances and actually make additional profit or benefit while customers were getting harmed, depending on how the mechanism worked?
So are you asking, is there a scenario under our proposed mechanism where the company would receive an incentive while gas prices were high or increasing? I don't know that we've really projected that out. Certainly not in the Uri situation, right, where you're seeing a big spike in prices. In the sustained process, depending on that benchmark, that may be possible. And I think that's part of why we've sought to limit the amount of exposure to be smaller. Agree that there's no perfect answer here, and you know, there will be different mechanisms are going to perform differently. So I think the challenge we found with the backward looking is just that it really would not change the way we purchase gas. And kind of coming from that place and looking for where could we create an incentive that could potentially have some change in how we're purchasing gas, even if it's on the fringes, that's where we look towards that current benchmarking.
I guess one last question for you. To the extent we choose to stick with the backward-looking approach, any thoughts on what benchmark price should be used? Is it appropriate to just use a year earlier quarter, or should we be looking at a longer historical average, or any advice or guidance if we choose to stick with this?
Yeah, I think from our perspective, we would support a historical average of maybe like 3 years, something that gives you, just looking at the last 2 years, right, where we saw prices as high as $7, prices as low as $1. You're just going to bounce back and forth between the extremes, where in 1 year the utility's paying a max penalty, and another year the utility's getting a max incentive. So I think it would be helpful to use a longer term average. I think it would be helpful to look at it on a quarter by quarter basis and kind of split it into quarters and have the cap quarterly, so that in any given quarter you might hit the cap, but then in the next quarter there's still an incentive. In other words, you're not just in Q1 hitting the cap, and then the rest of the year doesn't make a difference. No matter what happens, you're going to still be at that cap. Is another idea we had.
So are you? I'm not sure I followed you. So are you? I get the point. If you're going to look at Q1, for example, a year ago, look at Q1 over 2 or 3 years prior, or are you suggesting in Q2 of this year we look at Q1 of this year?
No, I think what I'm suggesting is, like, if we had a $4 million annual exposure, that it'd be $1 million per quarter, so that you wouldn't max out the 4 million in Q1, and then no matter what happens in Q2, 3, 4, you're at the 4 million max already from what happened in the first quarter.
I gotcha. I think that's all I had for you, Mr. Berman. So thank you, sir.
Okay. Thank you.
UCA, I don't know, Mr. Dixon.
Good morning. I'm on vacation in Seattle, so I'm a little less dressed formally, and I apologize for that. As you know, we have consistently supported the rules that were proposed, and we still believe the legislature intended something to change. It was not like business as usual. It was not like using these techniques of the past. And clearly it was not using Rule 4607 as it's currently written. The legislature intended the commission to do something different. And this was what you proposed, and we have supported that because we believe it's an effort to at least balance the risk, give an opportunity for shareholders, or ratepayers to receive some benefit as opposed to always carrying the risk. We hear from the utilities the fact that everything they do is subject to the prudency test, and that we have an opportunity to challenge prudency. Well, we did that in Storm Uri, and we were the only party that took on the prudency of the Storm Uri, and we were able to amass a total of $8 million of benefit for ratepayers on a $500 million bill. That's not being critical of the commission. What it is telling you is prudency is a test that we is not sustainable. It is not, it just simply, we don't have the information. The information is within the utilities. We don't have, for example, in the Storm Uri case, a meteorological event. Where was a meteorologist in that case? There was never a meteorologist put on the stand advising what they had told Public Service Company was coming. For example, it was a weather event, yet not one single weather person on behalf of the company, and the company has meteorologists because there were some exhibits with them, was put on. So the idea that, yes, as Mr. Stoffel says, prudency is always an issue. You yourself have recognized the prudency test is a miserable approach to trying to solve the issues that ratepayers are confronted with. In our office, which has basically the responsibility to try and do that, is really not capable with the information. Even in that case where we had emails, we had information from the company, we had a great deal of information. We couldn't provide a serious prudency challenge to that $500 million cost. And so the legislature intends that the utilities do something. Business as usual is not acceptable. And when you read the comments of the companies, in this case, and for that matter, even in the 168 case dealing with sections 2 and 3, you would think the law isn't intended to change anything. It's just keep on doing things. We do it right now. We do everything the correct way. The legislature doesn't see it that way. I agree with the comments of Ms. O'Neill, and I believe the commission is making at least an effort to try and comply with what the legislature intended. And so we support what you're doing, and we support the rules as written, because we do think that it takes a little bit of the pain off the ratepayers. We do believe it results in a sharing of risk to some degree, a win-win or a lose-lose as you choose to provide it. And business as usual is not an acceptable approach. And Mr. Skluzak is online if you have any questions of him or if he wishes to add anything.
I'll turn it over to him, but I just want to acknowledge your comments on the prudency standard. As a judge trying to decide on prudency under Colorado negligence standards, I just appreciate the challenges you're facing as an advocate trying to satisfy the standard, and as a judge, effectively a judge trying to make prudency determinations under current standards. It's just it's not easy. So
and that's why a different approach is necessary, because relying on prudency is not going to work. I mean, we who have tried to do that, we who went out there on the URI case, we're able to amass some amount of money. And $8 million is a big number, but now when you compare it to $500 million, and even if we lose on appeal in the Tiger case, we'll lose that $8 million in the Tiger appeal that's still pending in the district court. So it's just something has to change. The commission made a proposal. The utilities, rather than basically have fought the proposal instead of trying to improve it or come up with other ways. I will not acknowledge that Public Service talked about looking at a different approach, but you have the evidence in front of you from the utilities and their comments. And if you feel you need to modify it based on their comments, that's certainly within your power. But the approach of trying to ensure ratepayers get some win-win out of this instead of a full always lose is an appropriate approach.
Mr. Skluzak.
Good morning, Mr. Chairman. I just wanted to add on a few things that Mr. Dixon said. First of all, you're in a tough spot because the General Assembly has basically given you marching orders. Something has to be done. So inaction is not an option for you. So you're in a difficult spot. You and the commission have to come up with something. We understand that. That's why Mr. Dixon said it's not business as usual. Something has to give. Second thing, I was listening to Mr. Stoffel this morning, and I heard him say several times about the prudency process for the GCA. Now, in theory, there is that prudency process. I've been in this job going on 20 years now. I don't ever recall a challenge in that process from UCA or our predecessor name, OCC. So that's going back to 2005. I don't ever recall us challenging that. I don't ever recall the commission staff doing a challenge. So it's a bit, I don't know if I want to say toothless. It's just not done. So to rely on that theoretical construct, I don't want you to be misled that is, a real good option, because it just doesn't seem to happen. In fact, that's why we argued in previous proceeding, Mr. Dixon and I, that's why these liquefied natural gas costs shouldn't be buried in for cost recovery in the GCA. They're going to get lost amongst all the hundreds of millions of dollars that get recovered in the GCA. And then the third thing that I wanted to mention, just slightly correct Mr. Dixon. He said we were the only, UCA was the only one who challenged the Storm Uri costs on the basis of prudency. Your trial staff did challenge on the basis of prudency, but they then settled and you could say somewhat obstinately, refused to settle. And so we continued arguing prudency and didn't sign on to the settlement on that. So I just wanted to tweak what Mr. Dixon said.
Can you guys leave your cameras on for a moment, and I just go back to Mr. Stoffel or Mr. Berman or Mr. Koshin and see if you have any responses on the prudency arguments.
Yeah, just responding to what you heard from Mr. Dixon and Mr. Skluzak. So I think it's not a surprise that it's very difficult or near toothless to go through a prudence challenge on gas costs. And I think it's important to ask why. Well, the utilities have commission-approved hedging plans that they're required to follow. So one basis for a disallowance would be failure to follow that hedging plan. The utilities are also required to file each year gas purchase plans for each of their gas cost adjustment areas. And so another basis for imprudence would be failing to follow the plan that they put in front of you prior to the heating season. But that's usually what they do. That's what they did during Winter Storm Uri. And so you get into the situation of saying, okay, well, we've had these administrative approvals and process leading into these procurement decisions. And then ultimately, those decisions are being made in a wholesale market where the utilities clearly don't have control over the ultimate price. And so, yeah, there can be a certain blend of hedged volumes, a certain blend of month ahead, a certain blend of day ahead. And the more you load up on fixed purchases, the more risk you have of having to potentially resell excess gas back to the market at a loss. But so when you get to the end of a heating season and you're going to evaluate the prudence of gas purchases, it's no surprise that if a utility shows up and says, we followed our hedging plan you approved, we followed our procurement plan we submitted to you before the heating season, and we have no control over gas prices, there really is no imprudence to be found. And so then it becomes a question of, well, how do you mitigate the rate impact to customers? Now, we did that kind of on an ad hoc basis through the different Winter Storm Uri cases, as we've talked about today. Now we actually have the gas price risk mitigation plans in effect for all the utilities as well. And so we've got this now additional piece being layered into it that, as I started with, you really kind of, I'm struggling with the starting point of saying, well, how are our financial incentives misaligned? And we've heard from the UCA, okay, well, customers always have to pay. That's because they're the ones using the gas. The gas utilities are not consuming the gas. It's a service being provided to customers at regulated rates. And if a customer doesn't want to pay for it, they should stop using the gas. And so I think it's disingenuous to take issue with the threshold point of customers should pay for the gas that was prudently procured to serve them. And the idea that there's some sort of misaligned incentives in that kind of construct, I think is a fiction. I think it's the way the system was designed that the utilities procure gas through these different processes we've talked through. And if they follow those processes, they should get recovery.
Sounds like you don't like the legislation.
Well, we can talk about that over a beer sometime, but yeah. And my point there would be, so the legislation says you shall adopt rules to establish mechanisms to align the incentives. What do those mechanisms have to do? They must be designed to protect customers and to improve the utilities' management of fuel costs, and they shall be tailored to apply to different utilities based on utility size or ability to implement the mechanisms. And Mr. Dixon talked about a business as usual approach. The current GPIM rule was approved but never implemented. So the idea of operating under that rule is not incorporated in business as usual. We never even got to the place of establishing GPIMs to operate under. And our point is, if you look at that rule and you look at the requirements of the statute, they're perfectly compatible. And so then it's saying allow that process to go forward, which includes the backcasting requirement in the current rule, which I think would address some of the issues you've raised around, well, how would this have performed during these prior market events? Well, a 5-year backcast is going to show you that.
Ms. O'Neill.
So I just wanted to make sure I just clarify one thing that I think I heard Mr. Stoffel say, and I just want to be clear. The gas purchase plans that utilities file with the commission every year are not approved by the commission. They are deemed to be complete per rules. I just wanted to make sure that everybody's very clear about that. So in terms of a prudence challenge, it is more than just, did you follow the gas purchase plan or not? Since the actions in that JPP are not upfront approved, it is purely a finding of completeness. We are not deeming those to be the appropriate purchase plans when those GPPs are approved. I just want to make sure that everybody's very, very clear about what exactly those GPPs represent. I'm not saying that they're meaningless, just wanted to be very clear about that.
No, I appreciate that clarification. It is a distinction from the hedging plans, which are fully approved. And I guess the point about the gas procurement plan is it's the utilities telling you before the heating season, here's our plan, here's our strategy for delivering reasonably priced gas to customers when they want it. And it does provide the basis to compare their actual procurement decisions against after the fact.
That's right. I'm not saying they are meaningless. I just wanted to be very clear about what the baseline is. And if you ever saw a challenge on prudence, it may be not just that they didn't follow the plan, but that there was a flaw in the plan itself. And just wanted to be very clear about that.
Mr. Berman?
Generally, just on the piece of prudence, I just wanted to again highlight that the gas price risk mitigation plans do add another layer and do require at a certain level that the prudence review occur on those costs above that. So not to dismiss that there have been very few prudence reviews on gas costs historically, but there have also been very few events like Uri, if any other events like Uri, and that's where we did see that occur. And if another one of those occurs, it will naturally move towards a prudence review from the plan that's already in place. And then just lastly, acknowledge that the company has put forward a structure that we think meets the criteria here and is not arguing for nothing. I think Mr. Dixon did kind of acknowledge that. And really, again, back to the risk piece, we've tried to structure this around what is the appropriate amount of risk that should be out there from either a cap or a deadband or all of the other things that are part of this rule of where does that lie. And I think what you saw in our backcast was that we think that this is about a $16 million risk for the company annually today as it stands with the rule, and we've sought to limit that to something smaller.
Mr. Dixon, Mr. Skluzak, any final comments?
Your Honor, I'm not going to repeat myself. I think I hear where they're coming from. I think you clearly understand the prudency issue that we're faced with, and we need to have some other method to ensure that utilities do the best they can for the ratepayers as well as themselves. And the prudency test is not much of a benefit to ratepayers, even though on paper it sounds good.
All right. Any further comments from anyone? Ms. O'Neill?
Yeah, just more a question to you, Chairman. Do you think it would be helpful to ask parties to provide one final round of comments, maybe particularly specifically responding to Public Services proposal and to any, how we might alleviate the weakness that I see in that proposal, which is that I don't think it would have addressed the sort of long-term run-up in gas prices that we experienced 2 winters ago.
I think that would be useful. Mr. Davis, Mr. Acera, do you have any process suggestions on timing or next steps, or should we just confer offline? Mr. Davis?
I'll defer to Ron.
As will I.
Good morning, Chairman. I think that if it would be fine for you to, from the bench, to set a deadline for comments, maybe 3 weeks from now. I think Ms. O'Neill's clarification or specific area of interest is pretty clear too. So I don't think we need an order. But participants should have perhaps 2-3 weeks, let's say 3 weeks, and then I think you'll have the record you'll need to render a recommended decision.
All right, so let's say July 30th, July 31st, end of the month, comments will be due. Let's see if that's yeah, so Wednesday, July 31st, we'll make comments due, consistent with that discussion. Anybody else? Ms. O'Neill, anything further?
No, I appreciate the comments. And I did also just want to say I very much appreciate Public Services full sort of analysis and looking at the history of what would have happened in their proposal. It was very helpful, so much appreciated.
All right, thanks to everyone for all their comments today. We'll solicit, invite additional comments by July 31st. We'll convene with advisors and council, and once we get the July 31st comments, we're going to issue a recommended decision sooner rather than later. So, Mr. Dixon, anything else?
Just wanted to say thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to participate.
Thanks to all. Greatly appreciate the dialogue and the engagement, and we'll try and come up with something that makes sense given all these challenges. So thanks to all, and with that, we're adjourned.